Welcome, everyone. Happy to see such interest even on the last day of Safer Gambling Week. This webinar is part of the 4th European Safer Gambling Week, and it's the last event where we had overall 20 events, so quite a big week this week. So this week there was a social media campaign across Europe led by the EGBA members with safer gambling messages in over 20 languages. And if you want to follow any previous discussions, there was the hashtag ESGW24. So today I'm joined by some really amazing people, and I'm very grateful that they're spending their Fridays with us. So we have Dr. Michael Auer, the director at Neccton, and a nerd just like me, who does research all the time. Then we have James Carter, the head of safer gambling for Flutter International. And then we have Craig, a senior consultant at Epic Global Solutions. Looking forward to having more lived experience information coming in. And Annika, she's a psychologist and a trustee at Gordon Moody. And I myself am Maris. I work more as a research consultant or safer gambling consultant. So during this webinar, I do encourage you to ask as many questions as you want. I will try to ask them to the panelists as much as possible, and you can use this chat function to ask the questions that you need. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be shared tomorrow. Now, before we start our webinar on safer gambling messaging, tailoring communication for maximum impact, EGBA has prepared some slides from the EGBA Sustainability Report. So in 2023, 67.6 million messages were sent, quite a big number, with over a third of the messages being personalized. So there was a number of general messages about safer gambling, but some more personalized based on the customer's behavior. And if we go on the next slide, we see that most of these personalized messages were done through pop-ups, and 1% were phone calls. So although we see that it's only 1%, we have 160,000 phone calls done just for safer gambling interventions. And if we go on to the next slide, 60% of these personalized safety messages were sent to customers that were 35 years or younger. And 23% of these were sent to messages to the age group of 36 to 50 years old. Now, I pass over to Dr. Michael Auer, who will give us an overview of empirically based information on how to tailor communication. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Maurice, and hi, everybody. I can't see you, but if you have questions, just ask them, and Maurice will hopefully pass them on. I'm Michael Auer, director at Neccton, which is an open bet company, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about recent research in the area of tailored communication, personalized communication. Barry, if you could be so kind to jump to the next slide. Yeah, so why do we actually need communication? We asked ourselves a couple of years ago, how well do players actually know their own gambling? So how aware are they how much they're spending? And the way we did it is we asked actual players from actual sites and to estimate how much they think they lost. In the later paper, we did this with deposits because we thought deposits are much easier to keep in mind than losses, especially when it comes to online casino gambling. And what you see here is the fit between actual spend and estimated spend. And if players were able to estimate their own spends precisely, we'd have a diagonal line. So all the dots would be on a diagonal line, and everybody can see, even if you are really, sort of short-sighted, that the dots are scattered, randomly around. So what we found is that players underestimate their losses, they overestimate their winnings, and this, is one sort of, crucial indication that information is important. Information is adamant. Players need to be informed about their own spending, because only then they can, keep track and make up their mind and maybe, realize they are actually intended to. Barry? And here you see an example how an operator could potentially communicate with their players. So you see like a site which is called Star Vegas. There is a player called Juan Perez. I know the font is small, but that's, the player. Player navigates to a section on the site. In this case, they call it safety center. And here players, every player can retrieve their loss, their deposits, their spend, their time spent, their money spent. And this could be a typical example and, something every operator should do, whether regulation requires it or not. We know, meantime, many regulators enforce personalized communication, but this is, the groundwork. This is the basis. This is, what every responsible gaming policy, procedure, regulation should require, at its minimum. Barry? Here is an example of one of the papers that I published together with Dr. Mark Griffiths. And here we analyzed the impact of personalized messages in a real world gambling environment. And that's really rare. So before the webinar, I Googled, I went to Google Scholar, I checked, and really there is just a handful of studies, very few studies that have worked with real world operators and have tested personalized messages. Most of the studies have been conducted in laboratory environments where players were asked, okay, would you play less if you were informed about your gambling? And just a handful of studies have utilized real world players. I know a lot of operators do it out there, but very few share the information, share the insights, or make data available to academic bodies and researchers like Maris and I. And what you see here is that there was quite significant drop in the amount bet the 7 days after. Usually what we apply is a so-called match pair design, where we have players who receive messages, they read messages, we compare them to sort of analytical twins who are same age, same gender, play the same way, but don't read messages. But in total, this paper, and that was one of the first papers analyzing personal messages, supported the notion that they are effective with respect to subsequent gambling behavior. Barry? And here, those messages are typically not, constructed randomly. So there is a psychology behind it. And I just wanted to give an example here. This is the so-called parallel process model. I won't go into detail, but what it outlines is that players should feel that messages are relevant to them, right? So the message should address a specific behavior that they might also then be able to see in the cockpit information that they can retrieve, that they can view. The message should have a certain severity, so the message should address something which seems serious to them. And if it contains a recommendation, players should also have the feeling that they can follow the recommendation. If we have somebody high risk, which triggers all sorts of indications, a message recommending them to stop gambling completely won't be effective, because they can't take that step from 100 to 0. But the message should recommend, let's say, update the limit, do a self-assessment, perform a self-test, and sort of should be embedded in an intervention strategy which slowly tries to nudge the player towards healthy play. Barry? Another way of nudging players towards reduced play could be normative feedback. What you see here is players receive information about how much they spend, and then it's compared to other players which are similar age, same gender, similar playing habits in terms of the games played. Doesn't make sense to compare a sports bettor's behavior with the one of casino players. So it should always be, in terms of the playing pattern should be similar individuals. And that's called normative feedback in psychology. And that's applied in many other areas. For example, if you want to nudge players towards saving energy, you would send them there with the electrical pill. You would also tell them, okay, this is how much similar households in your area are spending, that's what you're spending. So it's not confrontative, it's not judgmental, it just informs somebody, okay, this is what you do and this is what others are doing. But we have learned that players tend to change their behavior if they see that they spend much more than comparable individuals. Barry? This is another study that we did with mandatory play breaks. So mandatory play breaks cut, sort of when players are forcefully interrupted, are quite common, but there is very little research there. In fact, it's maybe 3 papers, 4 published by myself and Mark Griffiths and Niklas Hopgartner that have investigated the impact of mandatory play breaks. And in most cases, those play breaks are just chosen randomly, right? So operators at some point of time just agreed, okay, if, we interrupt somebody's play after they have been gambling for an hour or 2 hours, or after they have lost significant amounts, we interrupt them for a minute. And we thought, okay, why is it a minute, right? So it could even backfire. What if players come back and gamble even more because they were forcefully interrupted? Craving builds up, and they want to win back everything that they lost. Could have easily happened. So we thought, okay, let's, investigate that, let's study that. And what we found is, in our experiment, this was a randomly, players were randomly assigned to different groups, not a matched pair system, but a real experiment which allows you to make, cause-effect conclusions. And some players were interrupted for 90 seconds, some players for 5 minutes, and some for 15 minutes. And we found that if players were interrupted for 90 seconds, they basically almost immediately started to gamble again. So very few players stopped to gamble for the remainder of the day. On the contrary, most players started to gamble again within a minute. So they just waited until, the counter came down to 0 and re-engaged in the activity. So we concluded that sort of, doesn't really do the job. That's not what we intend to do. However, if that play break lasted for 15 minutes, we found that players on average started to gamble within 7 minutes, and a lot of players terminated to gamble on that day. So we recommended, if an operator integrates embeds mandatory play breaks, they should at least for 15 minutes, because 1 minute, 5 minutes doesn't really make sense. Barry? Here, Maris mentioned before, I think Maris was 1%, 160,000 phone calls by EGBA members, safer gambling phone calls last year, correct? And this is a study where we academically looked into the effect, the impact of calls or emails, and the company data was NLO, like in the Netherlands, I think it's called Toto, the Dutch lotteries, online casino, online sports betting brand, which has a significant number of active players. And we wanted to academically study, okay, does it actually have an impact, right? It's one thing to do things, right? And to come up with, massive numbers in terms of activity, but does it actually make sense? So do players actually change their behavior if you call them or if you email them with a safer gambling message? And to make a long story short, it did have an impact. There was a significant impact, and although it looks here like as if the phone calls reduced subsequent gambling behavior more than the email, it did not. So it wasn't statistically significant. We didn't find a difference between the impact of phone calls and or emails. And again, real world players from a real online gambling site, and thousands, a sample size of thousands of players. Barry? And last but not least, well, when we published the study, I think it was slide number 3 or something like that, about the personalized messages, we found something very interesting. So we saw that if we send players a safer gambling message after they won money, it had a really significant impact compared to nudging players after they lost a significant amount of money. And we thought, what could be what could be the reasons behind that type of difference? And we thought, okay, maybe individuals are just in a much more positive state of mind after they have won money, and if I want to nudge them towards a certain type of activity, they might be more open to follow that recommendation because, they just won money. And we thought, okay, let's, try to nudge players who won money to withdraw money, because ultimately one can only gamble once they have money in their gambling account, right? And we know that many problematic players, they never withdraw. Whenever they win something, they re-gamble all their winnings and they lose everything. And for example, in the UK, the UKGC lately also introduced requirements that operators should nudge players to withdraw money, and they should even detect players who regularly regamble all their winnings. And what we did is, so once somebody won a significant amount, they received a message, and the message would be, happy to see that you've recently won. Why don't you use some of that money on a nice dinner or buy yourself something to want? Otherwise, it could be gone faster than you think, with a link, directly to the sort of, to the withdrawal. And what we saw here is in the table that 38% of players withdrew money after receiving that message on that day, and only 14% in a matched control group. So we see there's a huge impact compared to the players who read this message and those players who do not, because ultimately we always need to compare, right? In research, we can sort of conclude if something's happening, it's significant, but it could, other players or other individuals who are not subject to their treatment could, behave the same way. So we always need to compare it to a baseline. And that's what we do in all the studies. And that's what you see here. So we have 38% compared to 14%, which is a significant difference. And that's where research should dive in more specifically to find out, okay, when is the correct point of time really to send a message? When does it backfire? When does it nudge somebody towards a healthy behavior? And again, this is an academic study that you can look up, or you can email me, and I'll send it over to you. Barry, I think that was my last slide. So thanks for listening. I hope the introduction made sense, and hopefully we'll have a very fruitful conversation.
Thank you, Michael. We already started getting some questions, so please, I would encourage more people to do so. And as soon as I said that, I got more. Because it's really good. You have lived experience, you have psychologist, operator, and researcher. So really, it's a once in a lifetime chance to have all these people in one room. Before I go for the questions from the audience, Michael, I do have a question though. We look into messaging, and most of the time when we talk, or regulators talk about messaging, it's more about intervention.
Yeah.
But how do you see the messaging strategy differ between like when the customer signs up compared to when it's an intervention stage?
Yeah, I think we are leaning a lot towards, intervention, towards problem gambling, and towards, the small group of players which already, exhibit some type of, issue. And messaging, should promote healthy play, should on the one hand be, educational, and on the other hand, inform players. And, this entire aspect of feedback. To this day, I would say, not the majority, but a significant number of operators still wouldn't inform players about their own play, in an easily accessible way. Okay, they would have lists there, with the single transactions, but who can make any sense of this, right? Somebody should have easy access to, nice charts, easy to understand information. On the other hand, to address your question specifically, in one study, that I published with Mark, I think last year or 2 years ago, what we did is we looked into players' behavior after sign up, so the day on registration, and the 7 days after registration. And what we wanted to find out is how if players exhibit risk at some point of time in their life cycle, how likely is it that they are already exhibiting some type of indication on the first day? And we found huge correlation. In fact, if you look at all the prediction studies, all the AI machine learning studies, this is the one study like with the highest correlation between past and future, you know. And what it showed us is that a lot of players who exhibit an issue very early on. Because I mean, in reality, what's happening in a saturated market, let's say somebody has a gambling problem, right? They gamble with an operator, they are unhappy with their winnings, of course, you know. I mean, you published a couple studies in that area, Marius, right? You know, and then they create the next account, the next account, the next account. So it's important that operators monitor somebody's behavior very early on from the moment of registration, you know, because if you see somebody which registers, they also already deposit 5 times on the first day, they chase after their losses, they don't withdraw, then you know something's going on here, and messages can already be, you know, targeted to that very person.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience, and not to be rude, but I want to listen to others, not just Michael now. So, because then it will be like an interview, and I speak to him a lot. But like when measuring the effect of calls and mails on player behavior, do you also take into account whether the player has low, medium, or high risk? And I'm looking maybe at Jim here because you're from an operator and you can suggest from that side, but also Craig because you lived through this, so you can give us some insights there. I don't know who wants to start. Jim?
Yeah. No, happy to answer that one. So I think the when we're measuring the effectiveness of the messages at the different levels, I think it's really crucial to understand what the purpose of the interaction is. So what behavior are you trying to drive with that interaction or that message? And it does vary depending on what level of risk that you have for the player. So certainly at Flutter International, at sort of low to mid levels of risk, we the intention there is to get the player to stop, to think, to assess their gambling behavior, and crucially for us, it's to use a safer gambling tool. So that is the main purpose of those interactions, and there's not necessarily a need to push those players down to a lower risk level. For high levels of risk, we do need to slow the player down. Perhaps you know, the operator at that point will impose a suitable limit, and sort of messages at high levels of risk are very likely to involve a sort of manual account review from a safer gambling specialist, and you know, a human assessment of that player. So we're really measuring interactions which are designed to drive different behaviors. So I think we do need to measure different things there. And for at the low and mid risk levels, where the purpose is to encourage the use of safer gambling tools, then that's what we need to measure, right? So did the player have a tool active before the interaction, and in the sort of couple of weeks following the interaction, did their behavior change? I.e., did they start using a tool for the first time, or did they make an existing tool more restrictive? And then for the higher spenders, or the higher risk players, someone might be spending too much money or too much time playing, which has put them into that high risk category. And then so for the high spenders, we'd be looking at things like, you know, net deposits or net position, amount lost, stakes played pre and post interaction. And for players spending lots of time playing, we'd look at measuring the time spent on site, the time spent playing, the volume of bets. And I think differently from the low risk players, where it's high risk, we really do need to see an immediate behavioral change. The player is in a high risk category for a reason. It's not helpful to be there. And so whereas for the low to mid risk players, we'd be probably looking at a few weeks, you know, did the interaction work? For a high risk player, that message or that interaction, we want to see an immediate effect. And of course, us as the operator, we can achieve that by imposing a limit on the player. But if for whatever reason we don't sort of artificially drive that behavioral change, then we need to monitor those players fairly constantly to ensure that our message has had the desired effect.
Looking at you, Craig, now, I think it would also help. I mean, Epic works a lot with different companies, and you help a lot of the companies with different interventions, how to optimize it, but also looking into your lived experience. because you went through a transition as well, which is enormous, from social to regular to problematic. So how do you think those messages would impact you, would
So
have impact you?
yeah, thanks, Maris. It's as you say, it's certainly for those who don't know the work that I put in, and in the team that I work in the safer gambling team within Epic Global Solutions is for the last 3 years I've almost every day, I would say, worked with some of the biggest operators in the world, and their teams who deal with people like me, if you like, before they got into the problem that I did. I'm often asked the question, what tools did I use? And because I didn't, the next question, which is always really heartwarming to hear from the teams you deal with, is what did you see any? You know, was I aware of anything there? Whether it had been pop-ups, whether it had been chats. I didn't have any form of actual interaction. There's 26 of us lived experience now at Epic, both sides of the Atlantic, and we've only got one member of staff that ever had an actual direct, and by that I mean a verbal interaction, or on chat. But they must have been there. It's not, as old as I am, it wasn't a lifetime ago when I stopped. It's only 7 years since my last bet. Interestingly, to pick up on a couple of points both Jim and Michael said that I've made notes on, which really resonated with me, was I think from my point, almost every answer for me seems to come back to education. Can we get the messaging in as early as possible to normalize the messaging, to make people not think it's only for people who have gambling problems who need to start looking at and using these tools. And I firmly believe that the next generation, or the current generation, in every other aspect that we look at, the sort of safety measures are put in place, even at sign up. When I look back at my problematic, pathological, addicted gambling, the most harmful area of my gambling, I used to only look at the last probably maybe 2 and a bit years of it. And I think I did that more through fear than anything else, because when I do now, the further in my recovery that I get, the more I understand the industry, the bigger relationships we build with people in this place. It gives me sort of the courage, if you like, to look a little bit further back. And I definitely had a gambling problem longer than I accepted that I did. So the normative feedback side of it is something that really relates to certainly everyone in my team that we work with, probably everybody within Epic who has who lives in recovery of gambling addiction, because we all at some stage went from telling ourselves that we're gambling just like everybody else, spending a lot of our time thinking this is normal, finding people to point at, whether it be sports stars, whoever, high profile people, or even just people who anecdotally. And that was the dangerous bit for me. So in terms of the messaging, I don't think any messaging could have helped me when I got into that particular part of it. I see it almost in 3 sections, really. I've been really positively enthused this year, the number of payment providers, the number of people in this industry who have approached myself and my colleagues at conferences talking about how can we look at sign up, how can we change the way that we do things. It's always something I think that people have been a little bit scared of, particularly in the commercial parts of the businesses we deal with. So I think there isn't a simple answer to anything that we're discussing today, really. The progress needs to be made a little bit earlier, I feel. I agree with Michael that it's, when you look at the figures in terms of the psychological side of it, it has to feel the customer's making the decision. It's being nudged, it's collaborative, not confrontational. Because let's be honest, most people who see these things will just look at it, read it, and think that's never going to occur to me. So we just have to be really clear on the ones that we send to the people that really will need it, because I didn't see them.
Thank you. That's really good. And looking at Annika, so you're a psychologist. So obviously, when we look at people who might have problems, when you're looking into awareness messaging, there's always that level of potential stigma or shame involved. And I was wondering whether you could give us like a bit on how can messaging balance raising awareness of the risks involved with gambling, but without alienating or stigmatizing the players.
So, I mean, I think obviously I just want to issue a bit of a disclaimer almost, because I see those who have definitely crossed the line into addiction. So like they are past generally. I mean, gamblers are notorious for seeking help quite late because of the stigma, because of the shame, and the whole inner experience is one of inner conflict where, you know, it's really hard for the gambler to actually recognize that there is a problem going on. So because they seek help late, I don't hear any of the success stories when it comes to player protection. So I just think that's important to bear in mind. So I think for me, I'm thinking particularly, how do we protect those really, really vulnerable group where data is suggesting that they're not safe to continue to gamble. You know, they are clearly beyond the point where they don't have that kind of sense of conscious control over whether or not they use these mechanisms. A little bit like Craig was saying, it gets to a point, unfortunately, where, you know, you just won't even see that, because the invested behavior is one of chasing. You're chasing after an emotional shift, an experience. You're chasing after those losses so that you can repay the debts that you've incurred. Like a kind of small nudge for that group of people is not going to do an awful lot. So for me, similarly to what Craig was saying, I think that there is a lot to be said for early intervention, transparency in terms of also what Michael shared earlier. There needs to be an understanding of the gambler. What am I doing? How much am I losing? And this, I do believe, should be promoted for everybody. It should be a normal thing. You know, why would anybody want to gamble without having any concept of what's happening? So I think that is really, really important. Now, when it comes to stigma, for me personally, I think at some point, and especially this is where the really, addicted group comes in, I think actually as operators, potentially there needs to be less concern with the stigma and just more concern with protecting the players, if I'm honest. Because if we get caught up in the stigma that the gambler is experiencing themselves, remember, we're just sort of playing into the addiction in a way. And I think it's very important to break through that, normalize these interventions, you know, without being confrontational, recognize that actually, you know, the risk markers have now been indicating that perhaps you as a player is no longer basically able to make sensible decisions for yourself. Let's not forget that one of the underlying issues here is losing control. That's objective. You can see it on a graph, but it's also subjective. So the person themselves may wish to quit, but can't. They're compulsive. Yeah. So I think that, for me, the kind of bottom line is that there has to be a much, much better understanding of the underlying experience of having this addiction, and how that will interfere with some of these player protective tools, I think, is the most important thing.
I like that. I like how, you know, like you put back on the operator instead of worrying about the stigma, just do it. I think it makes...
Yeah, I mean, that's the longer term, isn't it? We can...
Yeah.
You know, if we get too caught up in the shorter term, you know, what defense reaction will I get from the gambler? How, you know, ultimately, you know, a lot of the stigma is experienced by those who do have a bit of a problem, let's be honest. The people who are with no problem whatsoever, they have a healthy relationship to gambling. How bad is it really to have it pointed out that, hey, you lost a bit too much money this month? You know, that's not a terrible experience. So put that in contrast to the idea that there is a number of people slipping through those nets and ending up at a really, really deep end of addiction, where, you know, their life is at risk, or their relatives' lives and livelihood is at risk. I think weighing those two, I think, is really a key thing.
I think it's good, and it's good to also see like how we highlighted from Craig and Michael as well, like the more proactive, the easier it is. Craig, do you want to chip in here?
Yeah, if I could, just to sort of rubber stamp what Annika said, really, you described me, if I'm honest, particularly the part about the stigma side. I'm very fortunate enough to work with so many brilliant teams around the world who actually have these conversations. It's becoming earlier and earlier. Often it's too late, but it didn't happen for me. And one of the things that I see it from the agent's point of view, or whatever level it is, whatever department of the company that they're in, that quite often there is stigma on that side also. I agree with what you're saying, is that they're saying, the challenge is almost, what right do I have to ask this customer whose own money it is, how have you lost so much money, whatever the question may be. Even the big winning conversations are becoming more prevalent and are really, really vital. The sort of drum that I can bang on this, and this is certainly from my perspective, and we work very closely with our team members. We know each other inside out now. None of us even got that chance. We would love to have had a bit of friction. We would love to have had that conversation. And more often than not, I do believe that you won't get that. They won't solve that problem on a telephone call. But we see it, and we're fortunate enough to do QA for a lot of companies, and where we listen to calls and we listen to the results. We get feedback directly from the teams that we deal with. And it's a case of almost planting the seed, because I got into such a state that my closest friends and my partner were asking me if I was gambling too much. So if I was lying to them, I'm going to lie to somebody who's ringing me from a gambling operator. However, I didn't even get that opportunity. So I agree with you. I think it is a case of almost accepting that there will be some people who might get upset, but that's okay. That's absolutely fine. That's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to get it a little bit earlier in that journey, and myself and a number of my colleagues never even got that opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's always quite anxious for the customer service agents or the RG experts to do it, but it's needed. I have a question, and I think, Michael, if you don't mind, I will direct it to you, which is quite interesting. So even maybe Jim, you might have a bit of an opinion here. One of the questions from the audience is it better to send a message immediately after the customer wins a significant amount, or should it be sent later, for example, after they lose 50% of their winnings?
That's a good question. So I think we'd have to research it. But no, I mean, it's better to be more. It should be timely, right? Because the winning, I mean, it's just a random event. I mean, statistically, mathematically, it's random, and very easily they have lost it the next day. So this is a good example of real time and of messages having to be sent in real time and not with a delay. If you address changing behavior, like you saw somebody is I don't know time spent has increased over the last month, or they have increasingly placed riskier bets or have spent more money. That's something that's not necessarily have to be real time, because you are addressing a change over time. But certain things, especially impulsivity, loss of control, their messages should be sent or made available quite close to the actual behavioral event.
Yeah, it's an interesting question this has come up, because it's something we're researching at the moment. So players who win a lot of money, what is their subsequent behavior, and what could we do to sort of reduce the risk that players who experience a big win go on to develop a problem. But the where we are currently is that I personally feel that the intervention should be in real time. So within within a minute of a big jackpot win, we would like to interact with that player. And I did note on one of Michael's slides, it's think about what you'd like to do with this money. If it's a very large amount of money, pay off your mortgage, or it's that level. And what we occasionally see with players who win that amount of money is where they were playing maybe 50p stake on a slot machine, it would go up to £5, and then £50, and then £100, and that win can very quickly disappear, which is not a helpful experience for the player, certainly. So it's a really interesting area, and as I said, it's something that we're researching with our own internal data at the moment.
Can I have one more comment to this, Maris?
Yes,
So
for sure.
the interesting thing is, if you look at data and you work, bottom up, then often you might detect things that nobody has noticed before. Because, if you speak with players, if you rely on surveys, you can only find out so much. But behavior is often not in line with what people do, right? I mean, I pulled up before, the theory of planned behavior and those kinds of things. And I mean, you see, like latest example, like elections, people do, act differently than, what they would say before. And what we found, bottom up, empirically based on the data is that often players would chase after wins. So it wasn't, so much the chasing after losses, but the chasing after the wins. So they have a session, and at one time in the session, they have reached a high balance, and then they gamble it all away. And then they are, much more stressed, much more willing to, come back to that amount after, compared to having a loss. And that can actually be explained with prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky, right? Where, if I give you 1,000 and then I take it away from you, the benefit, of receiving the 1,000 is lower than the pain of losing it again. And that's exactly what's happening when somebody has a high win and then they lose it all over again. And that's something that's never been, described in gambling literature before, because everybody talks about losses, chasing after losses, but not, the actual win event, which can do something psychologically to the person.
I think that's interesting. In a lot of lived experience stories, there was an initial win. I remember even like with Tony O'Reilly, I think even with Paul, there's always that initial win that gets you going. So it's quite remarkable. We haven't looked into it that much in research. I'm really liking the fact that we have like quite the more like quantitative views and also the qualitative view from the lived experience and the psychologist. And one of the questions now, and I'm going to go back more to Craig and Annika, who wants to reply, is what advice would you give to agents that are tackling those calls to get through to the lies of a problem gambler? What would you point out? Anything that you have especially lied about continuously?
Well,
I think this is
it's
quite
a tricky
one
one.
of the biggest issues for people
It's one
working.
of my favourites. It's one of my favourites because it's speaking as somebody who was a proficient liar and had to be when I got to the state that I did in terms of my destructive gambling. I think it would be fair to say that I was lying probably before it became pathological, because I think first of all I'd be lying to myself that it was something that I was still enjoying. Looking back on it, it would be really difficult to explain just how that could be the case, because I was gambling on things that I didn't enjoy, on things that I had no interest in, on things, and it wasn't at first something that would have brought up a red flag that would have needed an intervention. So I accept and understand the difficulty the industry has in noticing these things. There isn't a one size fits all answer for it. Otherwise, we would only have this once every few years and there wouldn't be the teams exploding as we need them throughout the world. My honest answer, and I say it in almost every session that we do, it's not the agent's job to worry whether they're lying or not. You only get one shot at getting your message across correctly. It's important that they do it with a real understanding that whether it's a tool that they're recommending, whether it's a question that they're asking, whether it's a stat that they're giving, whatever it is, it needs to be done with enthusiasm, because and not done just because they have to for their job. Now, most people won't notice that. Almost, if you interacted with 100 people, maybe 95 of them will just think it's an unusual question I've been asked, and might even just decide not to answer it. However, not just anecdotally, but empirically, the evidence that we've seen and heard from some of the some of the tips, tricks, procedures, if you like, that we train in a lot of the sessions that we do at Epic, is to ask questions in a slightly different way, almost not to get a true answer from them, almost to give someone the chance to reflect on what they have said to the agent. So I think a lot of the really good work that we see and that we hear and we learn from every team that we work with, as much as we can give our lived experience, the guys at the front of desk at the coalface are the ones who can change what's happening here. So I think a lot of it is, it feels almost like somebody would say, and I'm not suggesting the person who asked the question is saying this, but what's the point in asking somebody if they're just going to lie to us? Well, you can't unask that question. So if somebody asked me if I'd had a big win, interestingly, just as Michael suggested, as simple as asking, who have you told? That's great news. Fantastic. I'm really pleased for you. Who have you told about this? Well, you would think 9 out of 10 people would be delighted to tell you they've told everyone on Facebook or on Instagram or on wherever else they be. And just because somebody says they haven't told anybody, it doesn't necessarily mean that, right, let's press the button and get the net to drop on them, that we've got a problem gambler here. I believe where the huge success comes in is to allow somebody to be able to reflect on it. It might not be then, it might be the next time that they go to put a bigger bet on when it just doesn't feel right. So don't worry, you're going to get lied to, but your friends lie to you as well. And it doesn't mean that you don't want them to be your friend anymore. You know, I just think we need to be a little bit braver, to be honest.
I think, yeah, like obviously even in treatment, you get a lot of clients coming in who initially have chosen to look for help. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get the truth every single session. You know, I see many gamblers who are potentially placing bets, and then it takes them a few sessions, and then later they disclose that they were actually gambling while you were seeing them. They were, you know, investing in treatment as well. So I think a real important thing here is to not expect an admission. You're not coming into this conversation in order to have an agreement that the gambler has a problem. You know, that cannot be the aim. The aim has to be transparent information. You're basing it on data that you've gathered. You're not in the business of labeling this person with any disorder. You're not a diagnostician. You're basically feeding back to them. And I think another important point is the kind of, as this process goes along and you have a person who potentially is not responding well to the gambling, to the player protection tool, you're noticing that despite, say, a player break or a period of self-exclusion, you know, they keep coming back and their kind of risk markers are getting more and more intense. I think there needs to be a slightly more prescriptive tone to the whole thing. Like if you're giving a person a choice, by the time they have lost, you know, most of their money, they are clearly, you know, not engaging in healthy gambling anymore. I think we know that the choice is going to be to keep going, and I don't think that should be okay. I think at that point, you know, even if it's a hurtful conversation, so long as you're doing something in the best interest of that person, I think that ultimately is what counts.
Thank you. A question did come in when you were talking, Craig, which was, what do you think is the best response, or how to deal with those who say it's my money, it should not be your business? And I'm sure you have an answer for this.
Well, first of all, I agree. I think it was my money at first. It ended up not being my money, as quite often is the case with a lot of people who you hear who have stories like mine. My honest answer to that is, and I come from a very commercial background. I know Jim and I have spoken about it before. I was in a different field, but in the motor industry for a long time. So I'm not scared to say that, you know, we are in a highly regulated business that is we're in it to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. And again, it depends on how far in that relationship, in the conversation, and how far in the person's journey and the data that you've got and the previous you know, information. Has there been an interaction before? It still doesn't mean that I believe any responsible operator, which is everyone that we work with, should still make sure you get that message across to them. Then it's not somebody, you're not arranging a dinner date with someone. It's meant to be a professional conversation you're having, and it's as much to to protect the operator as it is to protect the customer as early on as it is. But my feeling is that if it was me, and I can only speak from my perspective on that call, I would explain that, yes, and we would like a little bit of your money every month or every week, however you gamble, for the rest of your life. We don't want it all this World Cup. And that would be the one thing that I wish had been said to me. Even going back to Michael's normative feedback, and myself and Alan, my colleague who we work very closely together, is the one thing when we read Michael's report, I mean, it's going back a few years ago, I think now, was that if we had been told, we were shown that we, or even just mentioned in conversation, that the style of our gambling put us in the very, very low percentage of customers that that agent had spoken to that week, that day, that month, that would have terrified me more than a pop-up telling me I still had 6 hours, I'd been playing 6 hours today. Because once I got to a problematic part of gambling, my brain would think, oh, is that all? I've still got another 5 hours until it's 11. Or I've had 2,000 spins. I would think, great, let's take it to 3. But if I'd been told that I was one of very few customers who have gambled in that manner, the last thing someone in addiction or approaching problematic gambling, in my opinion, wants to be is an outlier, because I've spent most of my day promising and telling myself I'm not the only one who does this. So it's bravery, I suppose, would be is the word that's coming to mind with me, and it's and it comes from the heart, from what we do.
That's really good. Thank you for that. There's a question, and I think I'll direct it to Michael and then Jim, if possible. So a question from the audience is, when we conduct interactions with higher risk players, in line with the GC customer interaction guidance, a deposit limit will always be applied following the interaction. When looking at high-risk players who show a decrease in activity after a phone call or interaction in general, how can we understand whether it was the effectiveness of the interaction itself or just the restriction in deposits forced on them that prompts this change in the behavior?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
of course,
happy I'm a moderator today. So.
I have an answer. Now, of course, I mean, we work with operators around the world, and especially in Europe, you have very hybrid regulatory landscape, and if you have deposit limits or enforced deposit limits, it can, of course, change, a player's I mean, it sort of, it's not in the, you can't compare before and after when you have such a manipulation. But what you can do is you can look at other behaviors, because very often, we're looking at very, at the players in a one-dimensional way, and looking at the deposits is one of those things. But what a person still, let's say they have less money available, if they deposit multiple times because they lost everything in the session, their balance in the session always goes to zero, they reload their account, you can still do this with with a limited deposit. Of course, you enforce the deposit, and you could tell yourself, okay, goal achieved, right? That's what we did. We have limited the person, and we checked the box, and we are compliant, with the UKGC regulation. On the other hand, the person might alter their behavior and somehow circumvent, although they can't deposit anymore what they did before, but they might deposit 2-3 times on a day and still reach that amount. And when they deposit, they always do it after their account has been depleted, and then we would still see this impulsivity, this loss of control. So I would recommend not to limit ourselves to one type of behavior, but look at multiple aspects.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with what Michael's just said. I mean, it is very difficult if we apply, just say for the sake of argument, a £200 deposit limit on a player, whereas they had been spending a lot more than that previously. They're now limited to 200. It's very difficult to say, well, that's because we interacted with the player and they realized they had to make a change and this, that, and the other. However, there's still, as Michael said, there's still things that we can measure after those deposit limits have been introduced, and that might be if it's, say, for example, a weekly deposit limit or a monthly deposit limit. Is it on day one of that month, is all the 200 gone? Because that does not really indicate that, yes, we've obviously prevented a lot of future harm, but spending it all within 10 minutes or on, it is not probably that hasn't resulted in a behavioural change, even though we may have limited the sort of potential financial impact for that player. So there are still sort of patterns that we can see and we can monitor even after a quite restrictive limit has been added to a player.
Thank you. The questions are coming in, but we only have 4 minutes left. And I think the biggest challenge that we will have now is if I ask a question to everyone and you have to keep it to 1 minute reply. I like how the people that I'm looking at that can't keep it to 1 minute are smiling. Just a way of closing this webinar, just one tip that you could give to someone working in this field, either about interactions or messaging. I start with Michael. 1 minute.
Have a clear procedure. What I see within, the universe of operators, of agents is very hybrid approaches, a lot of individual opinions, but I recommend, follow a procedure, execute that procedure, and, measure the success. Because in responsible gaming, we don't really have a true success measure. In marketing, it's easy. I want to earn more money. I want to, increase player lifetime, but what is it actually in responsible gaming? And that's something, I recommend operators to think very hard about. What do I want to achieve? That's, also sort of operationalizable that I can measure. So have a clear procedure, measure the success, and have a clear idea what I want to achieve apart from what, regulation expects from me.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, I would say I mentioned it in answering a previous question, is for each interaction that you have a clear plan and idea for what behavior you're trying to drive, and it will vary between the different levels of risk. And then you need to measure that interaction. You need to measure its effectiveness. And if it's not working, or even if it is working, can you do better? Can you try different approaches? Which works best for different cohorts of players, and I think that would, given that the vast amount of interactions that we have are automated, just out of necessity, I think focusing on those early messages, early tailored messages, is going to be the way forward.
Thank you, Annika.
Yeah, I think the main advice would probably be to familiarize yourself enough with the symptoms of addictive gambling in service of being able to understand just how different somebody who has a problem will respond to some of the safer gambling tools, because that's where so much of the complexity lies, right? Like so many of the tools that we've all discussed today, I think will work quite nicely for a majority of people, but there's going to be a subgroup of people for whom is having very little impact or potentially even worse, no impact. And I think only if you can kind of understand the underlying symptoms, the conflict, the loss of control fully, maybe by listening to lived experience, can we get closer to kind of getting that side of things right.
So last but not least, Craig.
Yeah, echo, I think, the point all of the guys have made. Of course, I'm bound to say, learn and listen from lived experience, from mistakes that we've made. There's a lot of good being done. There genuinely is. There's a lot of we hear the horror stories more than we hear the good work that's being done. It needs to be more. We've unfortunately got a huge pool of people who have been harmed by gambling. Use them more. Be brave, don't be afraid to make mistakes, and just keep trying. As all of the teams that we at Epic work with every day, we see that in all of the operators we work with, and be proud of what we do. It's we're all trying to make it better.
Amazing. 27 seconds left. So Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the speakers. It's really flew by an hour. And thank you for all the questions that were coming in from the audience. And we had quite a lot of people staying till the end. The video recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. And I would just like to thank EGBA for organizing such a good Safer Gambling Week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.